Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Sarah Thrall, and I'm the General and Personnel Manager with the Lexington Philharmonic. I'm so happy that everyone could join us virtually this morning for the third installment of our Connect virtual series. This morning, we'll explore the history of Lexington East End and Lyric Theater and share about the life and work of Lexington-born composer Julia Perry. I'm so excited for everyone to learn from and get to know our amazing guests this morning. But before I turn it over to Kelly to introduce them, just a few housekeeping notes. Even though we can't see everyone who is joining us via Zoom today or Facebook, we still want to hear and engage with you. So please put any questions, comments, or feedback in the chat or Q&A function in Zoom or on comments in Facebook. Our Connect talk today is hosted and led by Kelly Corcoran, who is the Lexville Interim Artistic Advisor. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kelly.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. Composer Julia Perry was born in Lexington in 1924 and lived at 216 Eastern Avenue. In her life, she composed over 80 works, had her compositions performed throughout the world, studied at prestigious institutions, and was one of a handful of US composers with music published and widely performed, a significant accomplishment, all the more noteworthy for an African-American female composer. Yet by the time of her death at the young age of 55 in 1979, after 2 strokes, the popularity of her music had passed and her contribution was widely forgotten until recent years. So this morning we have with us Miss Yvonne Giles, a historian and authority on Black history in Lexington, Whitaker, the executive director of the Lyric Theater and Cultural Arts Center, and Kendra, Preston, Leonard, a musicologist who has created a Julia Perry working group online with resources about Julia Perry's music, her scores, and her life. So today we'll be discussing both the history of Lexington's East End and the Lyric Theater, as well as a preview into the life and work of Julia Perry, our featured composer, for a concert we have coming up just in a few weeks on November 20th, Sorrow, Strength, and Love at the Lyric Theater and Cultural Arts Center. So before we dive into this conversation between all of us, we're going to do things a little differently this morning. First, we're going to start out by hearing from each of our panelists this morning to dive a little bit deeper in our topic, and then we will have a conversation at the end. So, before I start with you, Ms. Giles, of course, thank you, Kendra, Whit, and Ms. Giles, for all 3 of you for being here this morning. We're just so thrilled to have all 3 of you. So thank you. Ms. Giles, let's start with you and for some understanding of Julia's family tree in Lexington. When Julia was born in 1924, her family history in Lexington can be traced back to her grandparents who had lived in Lexington in the 1800s. So I'd love to start by hearing a little bit about Julia's family and how the East End neighborhood developed during this time until Julia left in 1934 when she moved to Akron, Ohio. So we'll start with you, Ms. Giles.
Just a sec, let me mic up. Is that good? Okay, thank you, Kelly, and I appreciate being asked to participate. And it's exciting for me because Julia has been forgotten in Lexington. She was here almost 100 years ago at her birth in 1924, as you mentioned. And over the years, no one really knew much about her. How I became involved or acquainted with her is through her grandfather. Her grandfather was Abraham Perry. He was a thoroughbred horse trainer. And for the last 5 years, I had been working with the Kentucky Horse Park to develop an exhibit about Black men of the Kentucky turf. And of course, Abraham was one of the individuals that we profiled. So once you get involved with finding out who a person is, you want to know every little detail you can find. And one of them is their genealogy. Who are they? Who did they marry? Who are their children? What did they do? So that's how I found out about Julia. She came into this world mid-1920s, but the family itself had been in the East End since 1870. shortly after the Civil War. In the time period between 1865 emancipation and 1870, the first census, after that time period, Lexington's African American population increased 133%, over 7,000 new residents. Abraham Perry was one of those. He came from Woodford County, is where he started. He comes to Lexington, meets Clara Taylor, who lives in the East End. They marry in 1880. And at that time, Abraham Perry had been a trainer since 1875. So he began connecting to very important men in the racing industry, became their trainers. He worked for men in not only here in Kentucky, but Illinois, Maryland, and New York. So he had a good reputation. In 1885, he trains a horse that wins 3 derbies, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Coney Island, and then 9 other major races in the United States. With his money, Claire, his wife, buys a lot, 2 lots, not just one, but 2 lots, and builds a large 2-story home and almost centers it so that they have a large yard surrounding their house. And it was here in the East End where the Kentucky Association racetrack had been organized in 1823. So this is where all the horsemen lived. Abraham was one of 5 trainers in the neighborhood. And they all lived within 2 or 3 blocks of each other, 2 or 3 blocks of the racing association. So they were, just very involved in the thoroughbred industry. It was a very lucrative industry for African Americans at the time. Claire survives. Abraham died in 1908. So Claire survives until 1929. So she's on hand. She's living with the family in their home when Julia is born. Julia is the 5th child of their son, Abraham Murphy. And all the children become musicians. They all played instruments, took vocal lessons, but Julia outshone, just her light just brightened beyond all the others, and sent her on a path that we are well aware of now. Didn't know at the time, but she has a long history. And the history of Lexington during the time from the 1880s to about mid-1920s, 30s, was one of progression. They knew after emancipation, they had to move forward. So they formed any number of organizations, literary societies, Masonic fraternal organizations, social clubs. They participated in arts and culture, had organized and participated in plays at the Opera House. There are photos from the T.T. Wendell collection, who's a physician. And we had a number of other professionals in the city who all lived in the East End. The houses are still standing. It's amazing how many of their houses are still available, still can be seen. But they were just very, very progressive. And unlike the East End has been considered now, but I don't want to say deprived area, but it has gone through transition. In the 1880s, it was all brand new. Everything in there, all the subdivisions, all the little enclaves of families were all brand new. It's just like building houses now in a rural area that has no buildings at all. So they had hope, and that hope was exhibited in their investment in their property, in their investment in their families, sending their children to the best of schools, and participating in all the social events that were going on in Lexington. So Julia may have been a child, but she was still influenced by the adults around her. She probably saw her mother and father and grandmother going out to the social events, going to the church, First African, which is still in the neighborhood, and participating in the plays and the operas. And most of us are probably the age, remember, we had to do plays at school. So we had all these things we had to practice and dress up for and go to. she would have been in that age group as a young child. We're going to this play and you're going to have to participate. You know how to play the piano, you can sing. So this is what they did. This is how her environment began before she left Kentucky.
Thank you for framing that history. It's wonderful to just hear about just this neighborhood and environment where she grew up. I think it's a really important part of her story. So Kendra, before we turn to you to hear what happens next to Julia, I'd love to stay in the neighborhood for a moment, Whit, and hear from you a little bit more about the Lyric Theater in the East End. So I know the Lyric Theater and Cultural Arts Center, it's just a 4-minute walk from where Julia Perry grew up. And the Lyric wasn't built until 1948, which was 14 years after Julia's family had moved to Akron. But it was and continues to be a thriving entertainment hub for Lexington's African-American community and really the entire Lexington community. So we would love to hear a little bit about what was happening at the Lyric from 1948 until 1963 when it closed, until its official reopening in 2010. So I know there was a lot going on, right? Like Ray Charles, Count Basie, lots of big acts that came through. So tell us about what was happening at the Lyric.
Yeah, there were, like I said, a lot of great acts who came through. Sarah Vaughan, B.B. King, Ray Charles, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, some of Elvis Presley's members of his entourage. But it opened in 1948, and it originally opened as a movie house. So during the time, they would show all these classic cartoons, these older movies, and the community would come out for that. It eventually evolved to this hub of entertainment for the African American community, where jazz and R&B became big in the 50s, and during that time, some of the, like I said, the great notable acts came through there. The Lyric also was also very instrumental in supporting, literally LGBTQ rights. The Lyric was famous for having wonderful female impersonation shows, which today we would call drag shows. The Lyric was originally built by some white entrepreneurs at a price, I think it was about $250,000. And during the time, many theaters, in the area, Winchester, Georgetown, major theaters, African Americans weren't allowed to sit amongst the main patronage with white people. They were forced to sit in the balconies. So when the Lyric was built, it was one of the first theaters that allowed open seating. So it was kind of a celebration of the African American people. The theater closed in 1963. And history books say because of desegregation. I always say it closes because of segregation. To me, desegregation was the overcorrection of something that was wrong. Or it was a tool that was used to keep the African American community from thriving, because if separate but equal worked, why change it? But desegregation for me was the overcorrection. When economic times changed, things centered around segregation. So of course it closed in 1963. It had gone through 2 sales with 2 owners during that 47 years or so, when it was about to be condemned. On one of the sales, it was a group that was going to do something really wonderful with the Lyric. They were thinking about having a homeless mission, but it didn't go through. So then that was the second time the theater was condemned. And then during the time, the mayor of Lexington and the community came together, put a task force together to allow people to come and see the dilapidated building and to take suggestions of what they would want. And then a plan was developed to revitalize the Lyric. The original Lyric had 940 seats. And the new plan with the Lyric, and which cost about $6 million or so to build, it changed it to a 500+ seat proscenium theater. It has an African American museum above the theater, where we have permanent housings. It also has a multi-purpose and community room, which we rent out for weddings and different things. And it has its own art gallery. So we do art gallery exhibitions, like our upcoming, we're going to be spotlighting the National AIDS Memorial quilt patches from that for the gallery hop. So the Lyric has always been an important part of the African American community because it was the one thing, during Jim Crow, during segregation, that we can call ours. And to this day, our goal is to keep the Lyric vibrant and alive and as a central part of the historic East End of Lexington community, because we sit at the gateway to the East End, and we want people to come in and learn more about people like Ms. Giles and the Lyric and the history that has been a big part of the East End and Lexington.
Thank you. I think it's so important for us to frame not only the neighborhood where Julia grew up, but also, these important cultural icons in the community too, that continue to be a really important part of the community. So thank you for sharing that as well. And we'll of course be performing at the Lyric, which we're really excited to do in just a few weeks.
Yeah.
So Kendra, let's turn to you now and turn back to Julia Perry. So what happens to her when she leaves Lexington and moves to Akron? If you can just give us like a brief overview of how her career progresses. She has these amazing accomplishments like studying at Tanglewood with Nadia Boulanger. She receives 2 Guggenheims. And then of course, bring us to these challenges at the end of her life, which include the disabilities she experienced as a result of the strokes, and then of course the impact of racism and gender discrimination on her work too. So there's like a whole lot there, but thank you for framing all that too.
There is a lot there, and I want to go back to what Ms. Giles said about how all of the Perry children were musicians. It was pretty common, but the fact that her family was willing to support her in becoming a professional musician was something that we don't always see. We see it sometimes, but not always. But so Perry grows up, she's playing the piano, she's a singer. She composes, she starts composing. The first piece we have of hers is her 1946 Prelude for Piano, which is a really popular piece that was published and is still available. It's in print today. And she goes off to school. She goes to the Westminster Choir College, where she studies singing and as a pianist. And she apparently does really well there. She's making a big name for herself as a singer before she decided to focus on composition instead. Her first pieces, during that period, a lot of them are lost. One of the sad things about Perry's music is that we only have copies of about half of it at this point today. Now, it's not to say that new pieces won't pop up in somebody's attic or, in a file cabinet somewhere, but we are missing a number of pieces. We just don't know where they are. She starts writing pieces. She starts doing a lot of settings of spirituals for a cappella choir. She does arrangements of spirituals for piano and voice and organ. She teaches for a little while at the Hampton Institute, a really important Black college in Virginia, but she's apparently not very happy there. She leaves it. She starts teaching privately and starts really doing a lot more with her composing career during the 1950s. So in the 50s, she is having pieces, as you say, performed at Tanglewood. She goes to France, where she studies at the Conservatoire Américain, where one of the teachers is, as you noted, Nadia Boulanger. Boulanger has a very complicated legacy in terms of teaching Black American composers. That's probably outside the scope of this, but I welcome questions on that if anyone is interested. She wins one of the big prizes at the Conservatoire Américain for her viola sonata, which we have still not been able to locate, but which is apparently just a terrific piece. So she's having a lot of work done. As you noted before, she wins a Guggenheim first in 1953, and then she wins a second one in 1956. And she is the first Black woman composer to earn 2 Guggenheims, to receive 2 Guggenheims. She uses a lot of this time to go to Italy to compose, which is also a place that's kind of different. We see a lot of American composers during this period going to France. We see just a handful going to other places like Italy, but she clearly really flourished there. We have tons and tons of pieces she wrote while she was there or that were inspired by her time there. And as you say, she comes back to Akron at one point. She's had a bunch of pieces, published and performed, but somehow the shine is gone from the media focus on her. They have moved on to other people, or I think a part of it too is that, while she's writing pieces that are spirituals or spiritually based, when she starts writing other things, a lot of organizations are like, well, what do we do with this? We don't understand what this is. She should stick with writing what she knows, right? And there has been this common trope from even the 1880s that the sound of American composers should be drawing on the songs and musical material from enslaved persons and from Native Americans. And when composers start working with materials outside of that scope, the mainstream musical establishment doesn't really know what to do with them. They keep pushing, can you write something else that's based on a spiritual? How about these other spirituals? And she's kind of tired of that, I think. She pushes back and she writes a whole bunch of other really different pieces. Some of these get performed, some of them don't. She really struggles to get stuff performed. She struggles to find a position that will let her compose on a regular basis. She teaches for a semester here or a semester there at different colleges and universities. But by the 1960s, when she's writing some really fantastic pieces, she's advertising for piano students in the Akron daily newspaper. She's looking for ways to sustain herself through, giving lessons to anyone in the neighborhood. So she's not getting the kind of support there that she deserves. She teaches in the late 60s for a year or two at Florida A&M University. But she also, her health is already starting to decline, and she suffers her first stroke in 1970. And from here, it's really difficult for her to get back on her feet, both sort of literally and figuratively. We have some letters from her saying, I've taught myself how to write again. I have these new pieces coming out. If you can just give me a little bit more time, she writes to one publisher, I'm going to have something great for you. But time is not really on her side. She completes a number of short pieces. She is able to complete her Soul Symphony, which she finishes in 1972, which is an amazing piece where she's returning to kind of what publishing companies and white orchestras think she should be doing, but she's also doing it with a lot of love and a lot of research on her part. She's writing these movements for a symphony that are based on the blues and based on other kinds of popular music materials. But she has a second stroke and she dies in 1979. And at this point, while she's been trying to get pieces out into the world, it's just not happening. She sort of lost the connections and the patrons that she had when she was much younger. And because major orchestras have stopped programming her works, she's faded from the spotlight. So there was a little bit of resurgence of interest right after her death in her works, but her works were left in kind of disarray. She didn't really have a catalog of her pieces. She hadn't made lists of what she'd written as she'd gone along. There were pages missing, there were parts missing. So what happens after her death is sort of everything gets collected up in different places, at Fisk University, at Westminster Choir College, in collections that eventually Helen Walker Hill starts to look through. But her music is not in a state that is ready to go out to the public for performance. And that's still part of the issue today that we found, is that a lot of her music is in manuscript, some of it is very difficult to read. And that, I think, has contributed to the fact that publishing companies don't want to take the time to hire someone to edit this repertoire, even though there's terrific music in there. So it's really come sort of to projects like yours at the Lexington Philharmonic that are starting to give her due after her death. And I hope this is something that continues. There certainly is plenty of material and events in her life for a lot of people to work on. So that's where we are with her.
Thank you, Kendra, for framing that. And you mentioned Helen Walker Hill, and so I thought I would just show this book, the From Spirituals to Symphonies, and we can put the link in the chat. But this has a wonderful chapter on Julia Perry, and just in reading that, I think echoing a lot of the things that you noted, her story is amazing, right? That even despite these health challenges that she has, she continues to reach out to publishers. She continues to reach out to people writing letters, and I think at one point in this chapter, it says that somebody advised her to give her collection to Fisk or someplace so that it would kind of help to prevent some of what we're discussing, right? The difficulty. And she says that she didn't want to do that, that she wanted to kind of go about other means. So I think it's just really fascinating, to kind of follow the chain of letters and her continued just advocating for herself through her whole career, despite the various challenges that you described. We have some questions in the chat, and before we get to those, what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to a little bit of the Stabat Mater, and then we'll have a conversation amongst all of us talking about some of these things. So let me frame this Stabat Mater a little bit. This is what we're going to be performing in a few weeks. This was composed in 1951, and it was dedicated to Julia Perry's mother. And the work is for contralto and string orchestra, and there are often times where Julia was the singer who was singing in the work during some of these initial performances. This work launched Perry's career in terms of the fact that it was performed many times frequently by major orchestras. The text is in Latin, and it includes the translation and the score that was by Julia. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Stabat Mater, it concerns the story of Mary with Jesus during the crucifixion. And yet there is a third important character, and that is the spectator who is observing Mary and the suffering and her love. At the beginning of the work, the spectator is in a detached observation, but as the work unfolds, the spectator wishes to share the burden of this pain and suffering, and yet also embrace the love as well. And so we're going to listen to the 7th movement of the Stabat Mater, which is quite short, and it includes this turning point in the spectator. And let me read the text for you. Make me weep with thee in union at the crucifix, there condoling. I shall help to bear the blame. Near the cross with you standing, sharing freely agony with him, forever, forever. This I desire. So we'll listen to a little bit of the Stabat Mater, and then we'll come back to these questions in the chat and keep talking. So that's just a very small taste of some of her incredible music. And we have a number of questions in the chat. And so I'd love to address those first, and then we can turn to some of the other questions that we had planned to talk about today. And the first one is, perhaps Ms. Giles and Whit, you would be the best people to answer this one. Is anyone attempting to preserve her family home on Eastern Avenue?
I can say yes. The home is still standing. It has gone through several ownerships after the family sold it in the 30s, mid-30s. It became the Elks Club That was one of the social groups in Kentucky here in Lexington, and the Elks organization was very large. So they turned it into their meeting hall, and they hosted events there, concerts and dances, conferences. And then over the period of years, it has been a church, usually a small beginning churches. In recent years, that's what I can remember being there. Chad Needham, who is a contractor builder in Lexington, he purchased it. And I can't remember exactly when, but in very recent years, and restored it. And he sold it to another individual. So the house is still standing. It's pretty well taken care of. They did do some modifications to the building so that it has a large hood, a commercial hood for a kitchen exhaust on the front of the building. I wish they had not done that. But it's there and it's recognizable. It helps us point. It's that large 2-story White House with the hood on the front. But it still stands on the lot, the two lot area that Claire Taylor Perry first purchased. So it is being preserved. There is nothing, however, at the home that actually designates it as the Perry House. So that is a challenge. We could probably put a Kentucky Historical Highway marker there. We have enough of the history to do that, or maybe some other recognition plaque about this entire family. The other piece to the recognition of the Perry family, they're all buried in African Cemetery 2. All the Lexington family is buried in African Cemetery number 2. Julia's youngest brother, she only had one baby brother. He died at 7 weeks. He's in the cemetery. She had an older sister, America Lewis, who died tragically in 1940. She's in the cemetery. Her grandparents, her great uncles and aunts, several children are there. And we do have a signboard placard. Claire Perry is the only one whose headstone survived the years of vandalism and neglect, but it's still standing in the cemetery. So we know exactly where the family would have been buried. But the house needs more recognition as far as this was the Perry home.
Thank you for that. Whit, did you want to add anything to that discussion?
No, Ms. Giles covered it. I was just getting ready to say that that the house still was standing and we know where it is, but I wasn't sure that if there had been a movement to provide a national historical marker, but Ms. Giles covered that. So
we should make it happen. So there's a number of questions in the chat, and I don't know, Kendra, if you'd be best to answer these, and maybe I'll just put them all together. I think you can see the one regarding Akron, and then if there's any recordings or transcripts, and then what years she was at Tanglewood.
Sure. So yes, Akron loves Julia Perry. Akron, I have so many newspaper articles from the Akron paper. No matter where she was living or what she was doing, she was in their news. And I think that, you know, there are people there who are still interested in having performances of her music and things like that. But they write about her until after her death even. You know, they really chronicle her life. It's always, you know, Akron composer makes good in Europe, and Akron composer has piece performed by the New York, you know, Philharmonic and things like that. So there was a lot of support from Akron. Recordings or transcripts of her being interviewed. I don't know of any recordings. There are a couple of print interviews that she did. These tend to be rather short. I could put together some bibliographic information if people are interested in that, or people can contact me about that. But there are a couple of those where she talks a little bit about her own work. And then finally, the picture of Perry at Tanglewood. So she was not at Tanglewood very long. She was at Tanglewood in 1951, and her Woodwind Trio, which she wrote that year, was performed there. As for contact with Kusevitsky, again, I don't have any evidence of that. That's not to say that it didn't happen. I have a feeling that sort of at that time, Tanglewood students were kind of You know, it was a sort of situation where you got to meet the benevolent great men, you know, in a very social setting, but whether they took particular interest in her works, that I do not know. I don't have any documentation about that. So, oh, here we go. Kusevitsky died before the Tanglewood Festival in 51. So there we go. So she was at Tanglewood and definitely did not meet him in a social situation or any other way. So she goes from Tanglewood and having her piece there, you know, to studying in France. And then the very next year, she's getting her first Guggenheim. So I think she's sort of using these opportunities, maybe not thinking of herself really as a student anymore, but as someone who is making that transition from student to professional and really focusing her identity on being a composer rather than a singer, where because she had been recognized, you know, more as a singer before that. We have one other question here. Is her work still celebrated internationally? Celebrated is probably not the right word, but she does get performances internationally. There are usually at least a handful of performances of her work every year in Europe. Most often, I would say her homunculus CF, which is percussion piece that is really, really well known. I want to make sure I get the date on that right. That's 1960. And that one is one of her widely available pieces. So it's easy to get and easy for people to perform. Her Prelude for Piano gets performed quite a bit. That's another one. Her work Carillon Hey Ho, which is for 4-part mixed chorus and is a Christmas piece, that sometimes gets brought out in the United States even, and is sometimes performed in Europe during the Christmas season. But a lot of her other works are not performed as much. The Stabat Mater is probably the one that is best known, and it is really representative of her work, of her writing. It's very dramatic. You know, the voice with the strings there is something that I think a lot of audiences find really appealing and exciting. So those pieces do get performed.
That's great. I'd like to come back to the Stabat Mater now and talk a little bit about this and put two questions together to maybe hear from all three of you on these. You know, the Stabat Mater is a Christian text, so I would love to know what we know about the role of faith in the life of Julia Perry and in the community, perhaps in the East End where she grew up. And then also this idea of suffering and pain that we see in the Stabat Mater. And then I think, you know, if we're talking openly, right, you know, with the health challenges that Julia faces at the end of her life, she certainly is going through a lot, right? And so I think it's interesting that this theme of the Stabat Mater is about sharing in that suffering and helping to carry that burden together. And so, you know, what do we know about the social support that Julia Perry had in her life? And did she have, you know, support as she was going through some of these challenges? So faith and social support in the life of Julia Perry.
All I can say about, I mean, sorry.
No, you're good, Kendra, but maybe I can start with Whit and then we'll do Miss Giles and then we'll do Kendra. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't, you know, adequately speak on the role of, you know, faith. And because I know they left when she was very young, but just by the fact, like in, you know, I guess in 51 when she composed Free at Last and you know, one other spiritual, you know, of course that coincided during the lyrics time when the lyrics started getting more African-American big time composers coming through to perform. But because a lot of her earlier music and even some of her symphonic pieces, where she engraves the spirituality of the African-American spiritual in there, I think it speaks to high level of faith and the fact that, you know, her parents were very instrumental in ensuring that all the kids, you know, learned music and, you know, were you know, self-motivated. I mean, after her stroke in 1970, you know, her perseverance alone had to be connected to her faith, because she lost movement of her right side, and she taught herself to write with her left hand so that she can continue composing. So that perseverance alone, when you think of perseverance, it is usually connected to a high level of faith.
Miss Giles.
What I have learned about Julia, I really did do a lot like Kendra. I had to do a lot of work with her. What I found is that the entire family, from Clara's mother, Amanda Taylor, through the time that her Abraham and America Perry were here, they were members of First African Baptist Church. It is the oldest African church in west of the Alleghenies, founded in 1790. They built their structure at the corner of Short and Dewey's. It's still standing. They were very active members. Their names show up on every anniversary program they ever have had. And I asked the secretary of the church to look through their church records, and she confirmed membership for all the adults, and then baptismal and Sunday school records for the children. So they were very involved in their church, where traditionally African-American Baptists particularly were very strong, rooted in religious education and music. It was always part of the spirituals, were always part of worship. It just was. And you had plays, children performed in children's choirs, they performed in cantatas, and if all the children had learned piano, violin, they were part of whatever was going on in the church. The other thing that I realized and have known about Julia from very early study, Abraham and America lost their only son. He was born in January and died in February, 7 weeks after his birth. He was premature. So that was probably very tragic for her mother. And I did discover that her mother had been a nurse before they were married. Then she has America, who's the child born after the son had died. America died tragically in a commuter train crash, and it burned. So they lost the daughter that had been born the same year that the son had been born. So that in itself, and from what I have learned, America had talent. She was a pianist, and mother and father both had probably put a lot of hope in encouraging her to pursue her music career. After America, Julia is still in her teens when her sister dies. So I'm sure just knowing the dynamics of tragedy in families, that she saw her mother and father suffer with the loss of these children. No parent wants to see a child die, ever. Her father honored the child, America Lois, by establishing a health clinic, A. Lois Perry Clinic, there in Akron, Ohio. So it said a lot to me how much they had put hope in this particular child that had just been taken from them instantly without saying goodbye, nothing. So that just resonated when you think of families who have lost, even in this day and time of COVID. You think of families who lose people that they don't expect to lose, and it's hard to watch the survivors. So I think her seeing her family go through this and her own personal reaction to the loss of an older sister who she may have been very close to would have set her on path to do the piece and dedicate it to her mother. And one of the biographies that I read about Julia is the author, Danby Green, said that Julia took music very emotionally. She involved herself in every piece that she ever wrote and performed, conducted. And you can hear it when you listen to the soaring of the music and know what the words say. You can hear her pain and passion. And it chills me. I don't know about other people, but it chills me because I too hear what she may have suffered and why she chose to write that particular piece. As we've all acknowledged, it's the piece that made her reputation. Her soul is in that piece.
That's very well put. Kendra, did you want to add something about the role of faith and social support in her life?
Yeah, I mean, everything Ms. Giles and Mr. Whitaker have said, you know, is true. And I just wanted to add that what's interesting to me is that not only is Perry drawing on music of the African American Baptist Church, but she also has sort of a more ecumenical view, right? In composing the Stabat Mater, she's using a traditionally Catholic form. Later on, she writes a piece that uses fragments of writings by St. Catherine. So she is drawing from multiple kinds of Christian religious genres and sources, you know, to express herself in the way that she, I think, feels conveys her emotion most fully. You know, the Stabat Mater, if it had been for smaller forces, or, you know, was set in a different way, I don't think we would necessarily get those shivers that Ms. Giles talks about. But because she's using this particular form and these forces, we really hear the force of her emotions. As for support, Ms. Giles, you may know more about this than I do. But one of the things that strikes me about Perry is that while there was sort of this robust and growing community of African-American composers in the South and in the Midwest, and sort of where the South meets the Midwest between Kentucky and Ohio and places like that, I don't know how connected she was or how connected she felt with that community. That has been something I have not discovered yet. So maybe someone else will be able to talk about that.
Maybe that is an arena of research that we still need to fully explore. I think that's what we were talking about before this talk even started, that there are still many gaps and unknowns in the life of Julia Perry that we still need to figure out. So we're coming to the close of this particular talk, which is very much skimming the surface of this discussion. And I want to conclude with a question about, you know, why her music has been forgotten and why it's important to champion it. But first, you know, there is a question in the chat if there's any information about who her teachers were here in Lexington and where she went to school. Does anyone have that bit of information to share?
This is Yvonne. I'm not sure. I have not seen information about what teachers she may have had. I do know that her mother and her father and his sister, Abraham and Lucy, were sent to Chandler Normal School, opened in 1872 by the American Missionary Association. And they opened African-American schools after emancipation all over the South. And Kentucky was one of the states. They continued to be here until 1923. Abraham and Lucy, the children, as children, went to Chandler. It was a four, you had to pay a tuition. So Claire used Abraham, her husband's money, to send her children to Chandler. Julia would have started at Chandler because it was the premier education site for any family, upward mobile African-American family. And I consider the Perry family in that category. They were upward mobile, physically, professionally, socially, culturally, economically. So I think Julia probably attended Chandler Normal for early years before she left Lexington. And the school itself taught the fundamentals, but they also believed in art and music. So they had art education as well as music instruction. And I would have to go back through the papers and see what teachers may have been at the school at the time she was there, because they kept it newspaper filled, like in Akron, Ohio. The colored notes in the Lexington paper was like our social media of today, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. They told everything: who had babies, who got married, who left to visit, who was in town visiting, all the graduating classes, the list of students, what teachers are doing what. And I've not spent enough time reading through all of the Chandler normal school activities. I have a few of them, but I have not read all of them. So I suspect that Julia was in there as a child performing, doing recitations, part of a musical or even art program. They did them constantly. They had programs at the Opera House. They used the church's auditoriums. So I think she probably went to Chandler Normal, although there was a public education school in Constitution in her neighborhood. I don't think she went there. I truly think she went to Chandler. Her mother was still, grandmother was what died when Julia was 5. But she had ingrained in her children. I know she had ingrained in her children. You make the best of what you have. This was just something African American families did. If you had it, they had parameters. You had to have a piano. If you're somebody in the community, you had a piano in your home. It's just how it was. It's what I grew up with. What my great aunt said to me: you determine a family's status by the church you went to, the schools your children attended, and the piano in the home.
Mm-hmm. It's really fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
And I never thought about it, but that's how they lived.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is going to be our final question as we bring our conversation to an end. And I'll start with you, Whit, and then we'll go to Miss Giles and then Kendra. Why do we think the music of Julia Perry was forgotten? And then, the counter side of that, why is it important that we champion her music today?
I think one of the big reasons that it may have been forgotten is, as was alluded to earlier, a lot of the manuscripts of her music been hard to interpret. Also, during a time and a climate in history when African American composers and even women composers, were trying to establish their footing and produce good works in a society that was controlled by white men, and in a society where, the expectation of African American music was, do some R&B or some soul or something like that. And because even today, I started playing violin when I was 8, but even when I grew up, and even today amongst a lot of African American kids, and that's why I'm really happy that Kelly and I met, and we're trying to do more in the community to create a broader awareness of classical music, amongst African American communities. Early on, especially when I was growing up, classical music was, it was either elitist music and you couldn't afford to go to operas, or considered white music, and it was music we didn't understand. But I think a lot of the reason her music has not been celebrated is because there's a lack of understanding for it. There is a lack of information about the catalogs of her works, and because during the time climate, I mean, heck, she had to go over to Europe and Italy to, as many the soldiers did during the war, more celebrated in France and those than they were at home. So I think that's a big part of it.
Miss Giles?
you know, it's hard for me to summarize Julia because she just, to me, she has taken have made me look at the family in a different light. And I can't say we should label her. One of her biographers characterized her music as eclectic. And I thought, really? And when she took the span, she profiled 5 African-American women who were composing in the United States. And she chose Julia. She had a specific criteria. She chose Julia because of the mix of themes that Julia used to compose her music. And as I've listened to some of the YouTube recordings of the performances, some as far back as 9 years ago, and I don't normally do that, but I got interested. I thought, where's her music and who can hear it? So there are some performances that have been posted on YouTube, but her music, I think, will open everyone's awareness to what is possible. Even in today's time, she didn't have the best of circumstances, it was segregated, you know, as Whit had said, separate but equal. That's how we lived. It's how everybody lived. But she tended to ignore that. She just walked around all of that. And I find that people in that era, there's another gentleman that I've studied, people in that era, they have not let circumstances stop them from becoming the person and contributing to society that they innately knew needed to happen. So I think this is Julia's lesson for today.
It's very powerful. Yeah, go ahead. Did you want to say one more thing?
No,
Okay.
I'm good. I'll get off on another tangent and we'll never get out of here.
No,
But
you're great.
I think she's a great example of what can be done and what possibilities there are absolutely despite the circumstance. And she found her way. She had talented, people recognized that talented. And she didn't let prejudice, I know she did not let prejudice in the conversation that was going on around her. Jim Crow era was at its height. She didn't let any of that interfere with her music and her contribution. She innately knew that this was important.
Kendra, final word from you, and then we'll wrap it up.
I can't say it any better than Mr. Whitaker and Ms. Giles have said.
Yeah. I think there is a tremendous amount to learn from the story of Julia Perry. And I think what we've all noted today is that this is the beginning of our discussion. So I hope that we can continue to discover her works, to champion them, to uncover the history of her life and her family and the impact of the community. And so I encourage everyone, I hope, to come to the performance in a few weeks where we're performing not only her Stabat Mater, but also some of her chamber works in the Pastoral, which is for flute and strings. So you'll get a taste of some of her music. And we certainly hope to continue to champion her music in the years to come. I want to thank all 3 of you for being here today. It's been such an honor to talk with all 3 of you. And I also want to thank the audience for your excellent questions and interaction. It's been great to kind of hear from you and what's on your mind. So I think there are a few more links and resources that we'll share out on Facebook, connected to Julia Perry. And we're about a minute over, but thank you all for being here today. And thank you to our audience. And we look forward to our continued work to discover Julia Perry.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
We'll see you all at the concert.
Yep.
Yes.